Hey everybody, I've got an amazing interview for you today with Justin Brierley. Justin Brierley is a UK-based author, radio host, and podcaster. He's the host of Unbelievable, a popular show matching high-profile Christian and atheist intellectuals. Many of his shows center around the intersection of faith and science, and he was generous enough to make time for an interview. In this talk, we discuss Bret Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt, moral psychology, and Christian morality in general. Justin has a fascinating season 2 lined up of his show, The Big Conversation, and he was even nice enough to share a full, unedited first episode with me before our talk. Episode 1, which I got a look at, features an amazing discussion between Bret Weinstein and Alistair McGrath on evolution and religion that I know you are going to want to see.
I realized that there was something wrong with the evolutionary story as it fails to account for religion, that in some sense religion is every bit as demanding of an evolutionary explanation as a wing or an eye or any other intricate structure that we find in nature. And I began to pursue what that explanation might be. We have a problem, which is that interwoven into, I believe, every one of these religious texts is a plan for competing against other populations. And if we continue to compete population against population, we will destroy ourselves.
Maybe the wisdom of Jesus still has a place in today's culture, love your neighbor as yourself, love
Absolutely.
your enemies,
well, I mean,
and
if you
do
take,
good to those who persecute.
I was thinking as you
The
were
full conversation between Weinstein and McGrath will be out on the Unbelievable YouTube channel on September 13th to kick off a new season of amazing content from the show, The Big Conversation, so I encourage you to subscribe. Until then, here's my conversation and interview with Justin Brierley. Hey everybody, I'm here with Justin Brierley, and we're going to have a conversation. I have about 12 questions outlined here that are just kind of discussion questions. To get us started, I'll just start off with the first question here. I want to dive into the moral argument for the existence of God, and my goal here is not to denigrate your faith or to convert you to atheism. That's not the goal of this conversation. So can you start off by laying out the moral argument that, as you understand it, the moral argument for the existence of God?
Sure, yeah. Well, for me, it's one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God, because I think it kind of goes to, you have to look within for this. And C.S. Lewis, who's one of my favorite Christian thinkers, was really converted to theism because of the moral argument from atheism. And essentially it goes like this, that we ask ourselves, do we recognize that there are objective moral values and duties? Do they exist? These would be moral values that transcend any particular time, place, or culture. If, racism is wrong, it's always been wrong, and people who practiced it in the past and people who practice it today, they're mistaken. It's wrong to be racist. That would be one example. Now, if we do agree that such objective moral values exist, then it's very hard, I believe, to ground them on a naturalistic atheist worldview, because if we say, well, these could just be adaptations from evolution, help us to get on with each other, flourish, survive as a species, that I think it still leaves the question, so what if people, what if evolution had moved in a different direction? Obviously there have been parts of the world where, and still do, where certain things, society has evolved into a particular way that we may think, actually, no, they've got that wrong. They're not living the right way morally. Very often I hear atheists say, yeah, but it's just about, us getting to a better place. There's no ultimate right or wrong. But then, of course, you're smuggling in an assumption when you say better. It means there's some standard, some objective, some kind of, golden rule, if you like, that you think does exist outside of ourselves that we're progressing towards. And for me, I've always felt that theism is a better grounding for this idea of objective morality. So for me, it makes sense that if we observe this immaterial but nevertheless real moral reality somehow woven into the fabric of reality, it makes sense to me that was put there by a moral lawgiver, a God who is the source of that reality, if you like. And there are lots of arguments to and fro. You know, there's something called Euthyphro's dilemma, is often put out there as a response to this. I think there are answers to that, but essentially, it's just an intuition at the end of the day. If you do believe, and most people I think do believe, whether even those who I speak to who say no, morality is purely subjective. At the end of the day, they don't say that when a mugger hits their mum. You know, suddenly morality becomes very objective all of a sudden. It's not just, oh, well, that's your opinion and this is my opinion. Morality, when we actually experience it, feels very objective. And if it is objective, if there really are right and wrong ways of acting, if there really are right and wrong ways of treating other human beings, if we really believe that human beings have certain rights and values and intrinsic dignity, the kinds of things that get spelt out in things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we've got to ask ourselves, where does that come from? Where is that grounded? And for me, the idea that we're made in the image of God is a good grounding for that. That makes sense of that intrinsic belief in human value, dignity, objective right and wrong. And I've never been able to find a satisfactory explanation of that idea of objective moral values and duties on a naturalistic framework.
So if I could present you a naturalistic argument for objective morality, would that change your faith in any way? I'm not certain that it should.
Well, it might make me reconsider this particular argument for theism, for sure. If you could show, I mean, I'd obviously want to hear the argument, but if you could show me that there's a really compelling way of grounding objective morality on a purely naturalistic framework, yeah, I'd have to say, okay, fair enough. This argument doesn't really stack up for God because there is an alternative explanation that's just as compelling. Of course, I've heard quite a few of them, and I'm not saying you haven't got a great one up your sleeve right now, Adam, but I just I've never I always find them, they fall at some level because there's always hidden in there an assumption about that there really is actually some kind of moral thing beyond ourselves, beyond just a purely evolutionary or naturalistic process. But hit me with it.
Well, I have 12 questions lined up for us, and they'll kind of illuminate the argument as we go. So I'm just I'll move on to the next question because I mean, this is a fascinating dialogue for me. And I started off as a moral subjectivist, very much so, because you look out into the world and you see there are so many different moral frameworks out there. So it's easy to say, okay, well, it's all got to be subjective if there are so many different ones. But I think people are misunderstanding the idea of objective, because just because there's a lot of different ways of doing things doesn't mean there's not an optimal way of doing things. And I really feel like morality is kind of searching. We are searching for that optimal way to do things. And you had mentioned slavery, and I completely agree with you that slavery was in fact immoral, even though in the past people had accepted it as moral. I believe that was incorrect, and now there are objective criteria that we can base morality on that are naturalistic. So I'll go to the next question now. So my question is, why do theists spend so much time attacking materialism or naturalism? And maybe attacking is the wrong word, but you are even in your first response, you are a little skeptical of naturalism or materialism. If most people come to their faith through some kind of personal experience of the divine, why is naturalism such a threat?
I suppose the reason that I focus on naturalism, and for instance, in the book I wrote a couple of years ago, based on on my show and the conversations I'd had there, I think the reason I focus on atheism, naturalism in particular, in terms of the comparison between the Christian worldview and atheism, is simply that it has become a very dominant narrative in Western culture. And that's the culture I live within. Now, if I lived in the Middle East, I might be much more interested in the Muslim Christian worldview dialogue. But this is the one we live in, and most of the people I know who are being influenced perhaps away from Christianity or are critical of Christianity in the West tend to be more stacked in the kind of the naturalist, atheistic kind of worldview. So it would be the Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris's and so on. So inevitably, their argument has, essentially been, a naturalistic explanation is satisfactory. We've got no need for God anymore. And of course, it's been also quite anti-theistic as well, that Christianity is also bad for us and so on. So I think it's responding to both of those. It's both to the worldview of naturalism that somehow God has been eliminated because of a naturalistic understanding of the universe. And secondly, obviously, to that other view that religion itself is evil and has to be countered in that way. So I think it's simply the environment that I find myself in, and what tends to be the most important questions that people are asking at this given moment in our cultural history.
I guess one of the reasons I ask is because I think the naturalist worldview, you're right that the anti-theists are making an argument that religion is evil. Well, religion is bad for society. And I disagree with that argument, but I disagree with it from a naturalist, materialist perspective. So when the Christians denigrate the materialist perspective, I feel like they're denigrating their own argument in favor of Christianity. And sometimes that doesn't seem as pragmatic a way of doing things. Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, obviously, maybe we need to define exactly what we both mean by a materialist viewpoint. But for me, a materialist viewpoint, a naturalistic viewpoint would be one that obviously excludes the supernatural, excludes God, and therefore, by definition, it is in conflict with the Christian worldview. So in a sense, if we're being asked to accept one or the other, I'm going to defend the Christian worldview and critique the naturalistic worldview. That's not to say I don't believe in a natural world where we can get really good ways of explaining nature and reality and science and everything else using natural laws and even various principles of evolution and everything else. But it's the metaphysical naturalism that I specifically object to, which is this idea that because we can explain various aspects very helpfully of nature because of the natural forces and laws of nature, atoms and electrons, that somehow is a complete explanation, that has effectively eliminated the supernatural, has eliminated any sense of God in the universe. And for me, that just doesn't follow. But that is the assumption in the vast majority of the new atheist kind of writings and so on. So that's, I think, why I take issue with a kind of that metaphysical naturalism. Naturalism per se, just as a methodological way of doing science, is, of course, we all do it that way. We expect a kind of a natural way in which the world will progress, in which the laws of nature will play out. Nothing wrong with that, I find, and that's perfectly consistent with Christian theism. It's the assumption that therefore there is no supernatural, there is no God in a kind of ultimate way.
Yeah, I understand the perspective. I kind of conceptualize the metaphysical being unaccessible to us, and the naturalistic worldview. I see that you can build a theistic perspective on top of that worldview without necessarily eliminating that worldview. And sometimes, I mean, you even said that they're in conflict, and I guess for myself, I don't necessarily think that they have to be in conflict, and the conflict is somewhat human manufactured.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear that, because I want to hear more about why you don't see a conflict. Because again, by definition, I would assume that a materialist, a naturalist says all that exists is matter, the laws of nature, energy. That's everything is ultimately reducible to that. And of course, that means there is no God. There is nothing beyond that, the basic substrate of, if you like, material stuff. That's what's implicit in the term materialism. So for me, of course, that is naturally there's a big conflict there with the Christian worldview, where there is a God, beyond nature, who created this world, that there is a spiritual dimension. So I'd be fascinated to know why you believe you could have that kind of naturalistic worldview, if that is the view you're talking about, and still get theism out of it, because it seems by definition it rules out theism from the very get-go.
Well, you can get theism out of it simply pragmatically. If you understand, if you believe in objective morality and that there are naturalistic causes for morality, then obviously you're going to be searching for the optimal moral system. And if there's naturalistic answers to how you get the optimal moral system, then I feel like you're better off examining the natural world to find those optimized levels than to rely solely on personal revelation, or however the theistic worldview comes about them. But it doesn't eliminate a deist type understanding of God, a God that sets everything in motion and lets everything play out.
Well, that's interesting to hear, that it's because most natural people who do subscribe to naturalism, in my experience, would certainly want to rule out a deist view, even just as much as a theistic view. But what you're describing, at one level, I don't have a problem with the idea of finding optimal solutions to, ways in which we can flourish better together and everything else, using the tools of the natural world, science or whatever it might be. So in a way, there's no beef between us on that front. I guess, yes, I do believe that as a Christian, we have had truth revealed to us in a way that goes beyond just the natural. I believe that the natural world does actually reveal God anyway, in many ways, but I also believe there's been this special revelation as a Christian in the person of Jesus Christ, and that the things he said and the life he lived and what happened to him in his death and resurrection have sort of shaped, if you like, have given a shape to what morality looks like, to what being a fully human person looks like. And so in that sense, I'd say, yes, inevitably, what I believe about my worldview does inevitably have some unique things about it that I think have a bearing on what I believe morality is and that kind of thing. Now, you might come back and say, well, maybe that could just as easily be explained by some sort of evolutionary process. And maybe there is a sort of, maybe they do go together in some way. Maybe there are evolutionary factors that may well have played into it. The thing for me is that doesn't, the danger is you basically turn religion into, as Brett Weinstein calls it in this discussion I shared with him and Alistair McGrath, a useful fiction, and for me, Christianity is certainly useful, but it's not a fiction. I think that where it does tie in with, perhaps some evolutionary understandings of why it makes sense for us to cooperate and that kind of thing, that's a happy coincidence. It makes sense that we might find a sort of a matching up between the two things, but ultimately, if we just reduced all of morality ultimately to an evolutionary explanation, I find that I don't find that a satisfactory way of understanding our intuitive sense of this objectivity about it. The fact that these things are not simply dependent upon the happenstance of what evolution happens to have dealt us with, the hand that evolution happens to have dealt us, that it really is, there is really actually, if you like, if evolution has developed a moral code, what it's actually done is it happens to have also connected with the objective moral reality that exists outside of itself, because it's only on that basis that I think people are even happy to, most of the time, to follow it, if they believe that there is actually a kind of a moral goal to which we're progressing, or be it through evolution or revelation or whatever it might be. Sorry, there's an awful lot, stream of consciousness there, but that what was the original question again? I can't remember.
You mentioned the useful fiction argument that Brett Weinstein puts forward. And that is sort of my position as well, the useful fiction argument. I realize this can come off as offensive. I do understand that. I grew up in Christianity. I think the power of true is undeniable. Like, it's one of the reasons why movies that are based on a true story are more interesting to us, because it really honestly happened. So, but as far as your detractors go, and let's call them anti-theists just for the sake of clarity, those detractors have a position that is religion is evil and needs to be eliminated. Are you not better off with your detractors possessing the position that your beliefs are useful but untrue than your beliefs are a danger to humanity?
Oh yeah, in a way, I think I can have a far more fruitful conversation probably with a Brett Weinstein or someone like you, Adam, than with someone who just wants to tear down religion because they've got an almost pathological hatred, sometimes it would appear, some people towards it. I hate, a kind of an attitude towards religion, which very often seems to go way beyond just an intellectual issues with religion, or it seems like some people are, have a very deep ingrained hatred almost of religion, the way they want to tear down anything they possibly can about it. Now, I mean, absolutely. The person who's willing to at least grant the fact that religion isn't all bad, and in fact can be quite good in many cases, is certainly someone I can probably have a really good conversation with. Which is why, I've been something of a champion in many ways of Jordan Peterson myself, having had him on my own show and got really interested in the things he's saying. I think he's kind of been a gateway drug for many people to taking Christianity more seriously. So of course I'm going to welcome him with open arms. Where he ultimately lands, I think, feels still more like where you are, that ultimately if push comes to shove, he's going to say it's still ultimately a kind of a useful fiction. But I don't know. Sometimes you listen to him and it sounds like he's a paid-up believer. I never quite know where he sits on that particular fence. But for me, I'm very glad of people like him and Brett Weinstein who are willing to give religion its due and not simply dismiss it out of hand. So you're absolutely right, basically.
Well, I hope you'll respect me in the same way. And this goes into my next question very, very nicely. So many high-profile atheists will periodically pitch new moral systems grounded in pleasure or human well-being. Why don't Christians argue that their moral system is better simply by virtue of its longevity? Isn't Christianity's cultural reproducibility an asset?
Yeah, I think that's not a bad way to go. I mean, that could be an argument. I think very often the argument that I would have against some of the more newfangled ways of either doing culture, society, whatever, is that really hasn't been tested yet. You want to kind of tear up the rule book, if you like, and reinstitute. That's what communism tried to do in a way, in the early part of the 20th century, and you can see the disaster that the Soviet Union was and everything else. So there's a sense in which I think we often don't learn, though, from the mistakes, and people think, well, every generation kind of wants to reject the rules of the past and reinvent it for themselves, and then probably only later in life realize actually those old rules were actually pretty good for various reasons. So yeah, I think that's a valid way of addressing one of some of those issues. Ultimately, the thing though that the first place I would usually go whenever I'm given a new way of thinking about morality based on some kind of utilitarian ethic or a pleasure ethic or whatever it might be, is they all ultimately still have a basic assumption that they're grounded in, that this particular thing is the thing that we should all be aiming for, and it's that objective sort of moral assumption at the center of all of them that seems to be completely missed by the people presenting them, that there's always some kind of an assumption, whether it's Sam Harris's, sort of most basic thing that we want sentient life to flourish or whatever it is. You still have to ask the question, why that particular ground rule? It feels like you're always going to hit that problem of why should we follow that particular ethic? Why should another individual do that? Because someone can just turn around and say, "Don't agree. I'm going to live life my way," and what you're going to do about it? And unless you have a kind of an oughtness about nature, I find it very difficult how any ethical system is going to get off the ground in a way that actually has that kind of element to it. So so that's my main problem with all of those systems is they all ultimately smuggle in some kind of objectiveness about them, whether they like it or not.
This is great because we're going to get into this. So you've talked about moral oughts in some of your other discussions. I'm curious, just for this conversation, it would be good to outline what you mean by a moral ought.
So I would say it's that sense in which we have a duty to act in certain ways. We can speak about there being moral values, so slavery is wrong. But the duty that entails is that we ought not to treat people that way. That there's so that, and it's the sense in which that oughtness is kind of imposed upon us. There's it's not just like a mathematical truth that exists kind of in a kind of abstract way out there that we might recognize, but doesn't really affect us. The moral realm, the objective moral realm that exists, actually imposes itself upon us and requires something of us. And so for me, that's the oughtness of nature. And perhaps the easiest way of bringing about, just sort of showing what it is by contrasting it with the fact that so many people, Sam Harris is the classic example, would say, well, here's what science shows us. This is the is. And on the basis of that, he tries to resurrect an ought, but it's the old Humean thing. You can't get an ought from the is of science. There has to be some other moral factor involved that goes beyond simply the fact of what nature shows us. Okay, nature could show us all kinds of things in evolution. The question is, should we act in such a way if we had evolved into a society where the people were still going around enslaving each other? If that happened to be the society into which we evolved, does that entail that we ought to act that way? Well, actually, no, because there's some other thing seems to be pushing against that, to suggest that the oughtness is actually different to simply describing what happens in nature, if you like. I'm sure this will all tie into what you're going to.
Am I keeping you in suspense, Justin?
I feel like you're going to unleash this massive philosophical argument.
I'm already on your side. I'm totally on your side. So, and you've done talks with Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson. There's nothing new here that I'm delivering. I'm curious though, because you can see that the world, you're conceptualizing a world where there is a objective moral ought. There's a correct way to do something, right? And we have an intuition about how to do something. Can those intuitions ever be incorrect? Can we have an intuition to do something when the objective way to do it is completely wrong?
Oh yeah, all the time, I think. I mean, I'm not saying our moral sense is somehow perfect from birth or whatever. I think our moral compass can be corrupted. There's a sense, but the point is that all the time, the fact we're having this discussion, the fact that we do all these things, we're looking, aren't we? We're constantly searching for what that morality is, what the right thing to do is. So it's, even if we do or don't think we've actually discovered it, the fact is, we think it's out there to be discovered. We think there is a right and wrong way of treating each other. So I'm not saying that, if you just sit down and read the Bible, hey, presto, you're going to have all your moral rules revealed to you suddenly. No, it's going to take more work than that. And Christianity, the Bible isn't, at the end of the day, a moral rule book. It's actually a book that reveals Jesus Christ to us. And it's really, I would say, as a Christian, it's through knowing him and what he has done for us and who he is, that we actually live into a moral life, if you like. We live a truly human sort of flourishing life. But for me, the whole point is, I could be wrong. I could be wrong about many things, but that wouldn't stop there being an actual, there still being an objective way in which, certain things are really right and wrong, and so on. I think some of our intuition. I think there are certain things that we can say. I think we know that. It'd be pretty surprising if we were wrong about that. The racism thing, the slavery thing, whatever. But I think there are obviously in ethics generally so many grey areas that we can't say, well, this is the morally objective right thing to do, and this is the morally objective wrong thing to do, because that's the whole way in which we have to weigh and come to decisions. But the point is, the whole reason we're doing that is because we care about right and wrong. We care about the way we treat each other. So it's not as though it eliminates a kind of an objective nature to morality.
So I would say, and you mentioned slavery, that slavery is one of the most glaring examples of where we did get it wrong. Where slavery, at one time, there was this moral intuition that there was nothing wrong with slavery. Otherwise, why would it exist? And I think objectively, we can prove through a naturalistic framework that is morally wrong. So I'm just saying that you would say that objectively slavery is incorrect, yet there was a time when they got that intuition wrong.
Yeah. I mean, so obviously slavery has existed in many cultures for a long time, and obviously still does to some extent today in certain parts of the world. But I would say yes, insofar as we acknowledge the intrinsic human value and dignity of each person, that people should not be bought and sold and treated in that way, treated as means to an end. I would say that we know now, we have a better understanding of morality. We've moved towards that objective standard, if you like, that I believe does exist. And so so I'm interested to hear what your naturalistic argument is for why you believe slavery is wrong. And there might well be an interesting argument to be had there. My view is that the reason we've ultimately come to believe slavery is wrong is essentially because we recognize that humans have intrinsic value and worth. Well, where does that come from is the next question. Well, my view would be actually the best explanation of that is the one given by the Christian worldview, which is that we're made in the image of God, and therefore that gives all humans intrinsic value, dignity, and worth. Naturally, my anti-theist friends will immediately point to the Old Testament and whatever and say, hey, look at all the slavery going on there. My response would simply be that I think God takes people from where they are and moves them on, and that what we're seeing a lot of the time in the Old Testament is kind of God dealing with a culture which kind of was dependent upon slavery, that was just part and parcel of what it was, but moving them on to something better, so that by the time you get to the New Testament and Jesus, and Christianity becomes this force where in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, where you see this trajectory towards what we now take as kind of more or less read in Western democratic societies, that this is the way we treat people now. And for me, that's kind of part of the trajectory that the Judeo-Christian view took. And my big problem with a lot of the anti-theists is how little they recognize the way in which the fundamental values and freedoms and we value in Western society are so much a product of that Judeo-Christian heritage, whether they like it or not. And so coming back, to your question, I would say I'm interested to hear the naturalistic explanation, but it strikes me that the reason we got here to the point of where we're in agreement, you and I, that slavery is wrong, has a lot to do with the Judeo-Christian story that took us to this place, and so that for me is a good explanation for why we hold to this particular way of looking at the world now.
Well, I agree with you there. I don't want to get into the slavery thing now because it's a little bit off the beaten path. I know the anti-theists love to bring up slavery. They talk about slavery morning, noon, and night. It's all about slavery. I did a debate recently where I lay out the materialist argument and the objective morality materialist argument against slavery. So I will send you a link there if you're interested in the actual argument. I lay it out in my opening statement. So I think it's a good argument. I'm curious your thoughts on it, but let's plow forward with. So how is morality grounded in God? You mentioned that you're grounding your morality in God. I actually, even as an atheist, think that I understand the grounding of morality in God, and I think it's a brilliant way to do it. I just want you to give me your understanding of it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I can give a very sort of detailed picture of how that works, because essentially all we're really doing is recognizing that this objective moral world exists. And we're asking if naturalism isn't a good grounding for it, then where does it come from? And for me, if God is basically if for such a realm to exist that goes beyond the natural, if you like, that goes beyond simply atoms and electrons and the laws of natures. If that exists in some way independently of all of that, then I think that a God who creates everything, the physical world, the supernatural world, the moral world, makes sense of that. I think only a God can really account for that, because that God would be the source of all reality. So for me, but that doesn't mean I can give you a sort of a mathematical definition of how that fits into the character of God. I think in a way that morality is sort of part of God's nature, that you know, when Christians talk about God is love and God is good and God is merciful and so on, that there's a sense in which God as the ultimate being, God as the ultimate, if you like, truth of reality, will, by definition, sort of be the source of goodness. That's, if you like, I suppose it goes back to some extent the classical ontological argument, which is this idea of God as the maximally great being, and such a being, if such a being exists, would have to have the maximally great virtues and the maximally great, if you like, moral virtues and so on. And so in that sense, I think that's why God would ground such a moral, if you like, worldview. Of course, that all sounds very abstract to some extent and philosophical, and that's one way of getting to it. In reality, the way I, if you like, grasp that in a much more personal and, if you like, less abstract way in Christianity is in the person of Jesus Christ, and that's the big difference. Is that I would say God inevitably in the abstract form as a kind of source of moral laws can still seem very abstract, but when God comes in person and shows you what love is, and shows you what mercy is and what truth is and everything else, that's something you can actually access in a much more real way. You don't have to be a philosopher to understand who Jesus is and what he showed us. And obviously at the heart of Christianity is this claim that God didn't stay distant and metaphysically aloof, but actually came to show us in person what love looks like. And that would kind of be at the heart of any moral system for me.
Well, for my understanding, just from a materialist perspective, it seems very practical to ground your morality in something that can be the ultimate exemplar of behavior, and at the same time be the enforcer of a moral code. So there is a very mechanistic way to look at it as well, that I don't necessarily think these two ideas are in conflict. It's more difficult. I think the anti-theists object to the moral enforcer, but I think as our society becomes less violent, less conflict-ridden, I mean, physically violent, I should say. I don't know that we're less conflict-ridden in this day and age, but it seems like we still need that exemplar, that idea that we can strive towards being. And I think God is the perfect example for many people. I think that's why it gives people purpose in their lives and whatnot. So do you have any thoughts on that before I move on?
Yeah, I think you can construct a sort of a naturalistic way. Absolutely. You know, there's a story to be told there of how the concept of God helps to drive people towards acting in more moral ways, whether it be, you know, the carrot or the stick, if you like, you know, the fear of judgment if they do wrong, or if you like, the carrot of wanting to emulate the source of love and everything else. So I understand that there is a naturalistic way in which God becomes a useful way of bringing about a moral structure and if you like, doing that. And to some extent, I'd say I do think that, if you like, the threat of God has kept, you know, historically certain kings and queens and emperors, at least from doing their very worst, by the fact that actually there might just be someone above me to whom I am answerable. So I think there's something in that idea of a kind of a moral enforcer, a kind of, you know, an ultimate judge. And equally, you know, obviously I believe many people have been inspired by the person of Jesus Christ and their faith to live more moral lives. So none, in a sense, we are in agreement maybe on that. Of course, the big difference is I don't think it's just that. I think that there is a God behind all that there is a God who you know, demands things of us, and that it's not just a useful fiction. You know, one of the examples that Brett Weinstein used, I think, in the discussion, and I can't remember now if it was in the main part of the discussion or the Q&A that followed, but Voltaire, you know, said if there was no God, we would need to invent him, on the basis that he was very happy that, you know, his servants didn't put their hand in the cash register because of their fear of God. You know, for him, there was a very practical application. You know, there was a very good reason why he wanted God to feature in the lives of his underlings, because it kept them in line, and, you know, meant that. But of course, if that's the only reason people have to believe in God, then for me, it's a very one-dimensional reality. It's because it's ultimately an illusion. You know, it's people are being sold a line in order to keep them in line, and I don't. And ultimately, I think morality has to be more than that, and I believe God is obviously more than that as well.
Well, it's easy to put a lot of value on the stick, but I think carrots are more valuable than sticks, and I think carrots are harder to create, to inspire people to act correctly on their, you know, because it's the right thing to do, is more powerful than getting them to act in a good pro-social manner through the threat of force. So I think intuitively God works on both sides of that equation, and I think in the modern world it's more on the carrot side than the stick side. So let's move on. I've heard you say that there's no mechanistic account for human intuition, the human intuition in particular, to value human life. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this? I mean, you have elaborated somewhat, but I don't know if there is a mechanistic way of looking at this. Is that a problem for your faith, or I think it might be a problem in general for the moral argument that a lot of Christians like to make, but I'm not sure it's a problem for their faith.
Well, maybe you could help me out by giving me a kind of a mechanistic, let's say, account of why we value humans, and then I hopefully I'll be able to explain why.
So my understanding of this in evolutionary terms is that we are a very tribal species. You would value other humans simply because they are potential team members. And the more team members you have, the more successful your team would be, competing for resources and reproductive success against other teams. If I have a team of 100 people and you have a team of 10 people, your chances of success against our team are diminished considerably. So that is the mechanistic argument for valuing humans. Now, the question that we run into is, how do we value humans across teams? And this is where I feel that Christianity has this hack where they say, love the enemy. Now that is a rule in this moral system that I think is very, very valuable. It's not in every single moral system because it allows you to cooperate team to team. And that was very difficult for us to overcome for a long period of time. Nations were always at war with one another. But in the modern age, nations very much cooperate. We compete and cooperate. So the finding valuable team members, I think, is what calibrates our intuitions towards valuing humans. But that can change, because if those humans we see as a threat or out to do us wrong, then we don't value them. I think we see this also.
Yeah, I suppose So I think I understand the account you're giving there of why, practically speaking, it makes sense to value humans, and that there may be, and that is the typical explanation I would tend to hear from an atheist of why we, live in, why moral codes develop within societies and so on, because it's about cooperation and everything else. And in a way, that may be so. That maybe our moral instincts do at some level arise in that way. Maybe there is a story to be sold there. I don't think it's as simple as it's often made out to be. But the point would be that, in my experience, people assume that this is the way life should be, not just the way it's developed. There's a shouldness now about the way we ought to interact with each other. And it's like I say, the ought is dilemma still seems to crop up. It's like, okay, so that's the way life, that's the way evolution. Let's go with your explanation there. Let's say that this is the way that our moral structures have evolved, and the reason we value each other is because of the usefulness it has in us being able to adapt to our situations and so forth. In what sense, though, does that mean that someone ought to do that? The person who's just the social psychopath who doesn't want to obey the rules, the social norms, the etiquette, in what sense is he doing something wrong if he simply ignores that, if he simply goes against that? Why shouldn't he do that? Because at the end of the day, all he's doing is sort of going against his biological best interest, let's say. And that, for me, I don't quite see why that becomes a moral imperative that they should act in that way. So it feels to me like, even if you've got this story about how the moral structures arose, it still doesn't imply that we should follow those particular ways of acting in the world, even if they're very useful at helping us to get along and flourish in society and so on. Because I don't see how the is of that translates into the oughtness. And beyond that, I just see that, we as I say, we're fortunate to live in the Judeo-Christian saturated West, but other societies develop very different moral codes, where, you know, child sacrifice takes place, or you know, racism, slavery exists, or whatever. That's the point at which they've evolved to. That's the place that their particular story of evolution has taken them. But yet, so what gives us the right to say, well, sorry, you have got that wrong. That's actually not the way things should be. Because if that's simply where they've got to, then that's just the way it is. It's that's their morality. That's, you know, the way it works for them. But most of us aren't prepared to say that treating women in that way, or children or whatever, is fine if that's just the way they've evolved up to that point. So it feels like simply saying, just simply saying evolution is the yardstick, whatever, you know, the morality that evolution delivers to us is going to be our yardstick, isn't enough, because we recognize that it doesn't always deliver the right results. Most of us would say, actually, there's a principle beyond simply the pragmatics of evolution about where we're heading. There's a kind of, you know, some people call it a telos to life and the universe. There's a moral arc to reality that we're supposed to be tracking, and whether or not evolution happens to line up with that, it exists independently of the whole thing. That's my long-winded answer.
Yeah, there's a lot of agreement here. You're saying that there are other moral systems that maybe endorse things like slavery, and you can go to those people and say, you've got this wrong because of our Christian worldview. And you have a story that's compelling about Jesus dying for people's sins, and there being this ultimate good in the universe that is God. That's a compelling story that people might buy into. My story is a cold, mechanistic, naturalistic story that I secede that it's not as compelling as your story. But I think it is in some respects true, and that we can show them evidence of why slavery is morally wrong from a naturalistic perspective. I'm questioning. I guess my question is, if we have both of these tools in our toolbox, does that denigrate the Christian argument in any way? Because a lot of times I don't feel that it does.
Well, you might be right. You know, when it comes to simply let's get to the morally right outcome, you might say, well, if the naturalistic argument persuades them, use that. If the Christian worldview persuades them, use that. The important thing is we get to the right moral outcome. Okay, so in a way, fine. The point would be for me, though, is I'm never going to be satisfied myself with just a naturalistic argument. I mean, because it didn't have to be that way. Again, I haven't heard your argument for why slavery on a naturalistic view is wrong, but whatever that argument is, presumably it's going to be something to do with it runs counter to the ways in which humans ultimately flourish as a society and as individuals. I still haven't heard what obligates people to follow that, because that is the way. Well, what do you say to the society which says, we've just got a different understanding of flourishing to you? I know I'm breaking Godwin's law, but if the Nazis had won, if we lived now in a society where Jews were considered garbage and should be gassed, if ever you come across one, the question is, would that just be the way things are, or actually has something gone wrong at that point where we say, no, there's an oughtness about this. We don't just do whatever is. The thing that is the current fashion doesn't just become our moral standard. There's actually something beyond that. And for me, I just don't see why presenting someone with the thing that is there, that is your version of what flourishing looks like compared to theirs, because the Nazis could just turn around and say, well, that's very nice, Adam, but I've got this is my view of what constitutes human flourishing. How are you going to differentiate between those? How are you going to insist on that yours is the morally superior view, and that people ought to follow that? For me, if all you're pointing to is ultimately a naturalistic explanation, it doesn't carry the weight of conviction, and that shouldness isn't there. You're just presenting people what is and what works for this particular outcome. But why that particular outcome? What if I'm not interested in that particular outcome? I just don't see where the oughtness of that comes from in that situation.
The naturalistic worldview, and you've touched on it brilliantly here, is not motivating. Like, it's not motivating at all. So we are very much in agreement there. I have a question, and this has come up in other talks. I had a talk with Paul Vanderklay, and it came up. It's an interesting debate on whether or not the Nazis could have won the war. Now, in my worldview, I don't believe that they could have, because I think that their ethical system was fundamentally flawed. And that's what we're talking about here. The Nazis no longer exist today. Did their ethical system survive over a long period of time?
Well, no, but I wouldn't assume that just because they didn't. I mean, history is a long and winding thing, and there have been lots.
So you're worried that it could survive over a long period of time?
I'm saying it could, and I would say you look back historically, and very nasty regimes have flourished for a long time. We happen to be living in an epoch of civilization where in the West we have these values and a relative amount of peace. Though of course there's still a lot of stuff going on in other cultures and regimes that exist, but we wouldn't want to put a stamp of approval on. But you go back to the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the whatever, they existed and were the dominant cultures in their time and place for centuries, almost millennia in some cases. And so I don't see this idea that necessarily kind of that just on an big evolutionary picture, the right thing will out in the end. It did in the case of Nazi Germany, but that was only less than 100 years ago. It's kind of so it's a fairly small thing in the big sweep of history, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't want to get sidetracked on this argument.
You'll have to go and listen to that debate you had with Paul Vanderklay.
It's a fascinating debate. And I've actually tried to get Paul Vanderklay to debate me whether or not the Nazis have won the war. That might come up, because I do have a debate coming up with Paul Vanderklay. But I'll move on to the next question, because I think this is really my most interesting question for you. If there is a scientific explanation for the existence of morality, and that explanation supports the behavioral prescriptions of Christianity, would this strengthen the case for Christianity, or weaken it simply by explaining Christianity's value mechanistically, materialistically?
It depends to some extent on the theory. I think that's the problem. Because at one level, I would say that the danger is, yes, that the Brett Weinsteins of this world will leap on such a theory and say, well, there you go. That's why Christianity has done well, because it was, promoting a way of living that, in fact, we now know is just an evolutionary instinct, or can be explained in a purely naturalistic way. So much for Christianity. Let's just hold on to the values now. We can kind of reject the supernatural elements of this, and that essentially is what Brett Weinstein kind of says at some level. the thing for me is that I'm not. It's at the point at which the theory explains away God, explains away Christianity, that would cause my hackles to rise. Simply pointing out from science and psychology and so on that there are lots of ways in which it turns out the wisdom of Scripture and Jesus and so on is supported by what goes on naturally in the world. That I have no problem with. The Jonathan Haidt who says, hey, there's loads of great principles from the Bible that actually map onto what we know about psychology really well. I'd say, hallelujah. There's a great confluence between what happens psychologically and biologically, and the ancient wisdom of the Jewish people and what we know from Scripture about the revelation of Jesus Christ and the way he wants us to treat each other. But for me, that would simply be a supporting argument for Christianity. It would say there's this natural correlation between natural revelation, if you like, that I see in science and psychology, and scriptural revelation in the person of Jesus. But it's when the person uses that argument to effectively say, well, now we can explain away Christianity. Now we know why it was successful, and that was the only thing that was holding it up. Because I think actually it is successful because it's morally right, but it's also successful because it's true. And the worry is that the Brett Weinsteins want to basically take the morally good stuff and say, now we can forget about, its other truth claims, basically. And that's kind of done and dusted.
Well, they're making, I feel that they're making an assumption that the supernatural element is non-essential. I don't necessarily believe that. I think the supernatural element may very well be essential. So stripping that out of the moral system and still maintaining the same moral system may be an impossibility.
Well, you might be right there, but it still leaves a bad taste in my mouth that and I don't want to speak badly of Brett because I really enjoyed that conversation with him. But let's say whoever is presenting this, it sounds a bit like they're saying, well, we enlightened ones know that there's really no God, but we need God in order to keep the masses in line and for people to, and it feels rather patronizing almost at one level to kind of basically say, well, the intelligent people know that God doesn't exist, but we're not going to take that belief away from the masses because it's important to get a functioning society going. So there's a good reason to let them believe what they want to believe. But it just feels a bit patronizing because there's always this assumption. I so often run into this assumption that, well, you've kind of basically left your brain behind if you actually believe in God, even if all of the psychology and everything else marries up quite well with the Bible or whatever. That's a kind of happy coincidence, or it's, it explains why Christianity did well, but we can, the most intelligent among us have sort of, seen through all of that to the real state of things. And my view is actually, no, I think the reason God might be such an important part of a moral framework is because it's true. I think that should be taken seriously. And in the end, I find that the moral view, the scientific view, so many aspects of philosophy, just our sense that there is a purpose to life, that we humans can't live without that. All of, for me, is pointing towards one explanation, and that's God. And I think it's a very rational thing to believe in God on that basis. I find it a very compelling worldview, and so I feel a bit talked down to if people assume, well, all the rational people obviously have got over the God thing, but we're willing to let people believe it if it helps, create a stable society. I think that's a bit of an arrogant view.
Yeah, I struggle with that myself, and I don't ever want to come off as patronizing. One of the reasons why I think Jordan Peterson avoids that topic so much is because it's kind of impossible to broach the subject without coming off as patronizing. And I guess I'm really asking you, is there any way around that? Is there any way that these two, because I feel like these two worldviews should be collaborating and not in conflict with one another. And I think the conflict does come down to this feeling of being talked down to or patronized.
Yeah. Well, I would say I love the fact that you want to collaborate, and I think we're much better off trying to find points of commonality than simply slagging each other off. So I had Jonathan Haidt on my show earlier this year, and he's really popular among many Christians, especially evangelical Christians, because I think he takes religion seriously, and he takes he has obviously written books more or less on the way that religion can have a very positive impact on psychology and morality and everything else. And so he in that way he's a breath of fresh air, him and Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson, to the Richard Dawkins and the Sam Harrises and the Christopher Hitchens who are so anti-theistic and simply want to tear it all down. So in that way, I appreciate that, and I would say yes, let's collaborate. But again, it's just at that point where where ultimately we've still got a difference of opinion, which is what is reality ultimately founded upon. And I want you to meet that reality. For me, it's a person called Jesus Christ, and I'm going to be happy if we can have some measure of agreement, because we both appreciate the value of religion in the world, especially Christianity. But I'm not going to be satisfied fully until you, Adam, have come to the same view as I have. That I'm just talking honestly here. Because I really believe that Jesus Christ is the center of history, the center of moral philosophy, is the center of everything. That's my worldview. That's why I'm a Christian. I'll always feel we've only got halfway there if we're just agreeing on, we can kind of come up with similar moral frameworks from both different perspectives or whatever. And so I'm just talking honestly, that's just the way it functions for me.
Well, I'm being honest with you too, and I hope I don't come off as too patronizing. I have 4 more questions, and these are probably the most patronizing questions in the world. So let me offend
me, I should say, because I have been hosting this show where I've had some of the rudest people you can imagine on, and you are probably you are in the top 5 most polite people I've ever had a conversation with, Adam. So.
They make me feel awful, not just because they are impolite, but because they are, in my view, scientifically wrong, and they're standing under the banner of science, talking nonsense, which is how can an atheist become more offended?
If you want the example par excellence, search up. Well, there's a couple of examples on my YouTube channel, but any video that features Professor Peter Atkins, and you will see the extreme end of that.
I haven't acquainted myself with him, but I'm looking forward to it. So let's move on to the competitor that your anti-theist tribe is putting forward, secular humanism. I want to talk a little bit about secular humanism before we end. So you've talked in the past about secular humanism, where the highest value seems to be scientific truth and well-being. These are the highest values of secular humanism, right? They value scientific truth and human flourishing a lot of times, they say. So can you give us your personal take on secular humanism?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, just for the sake of time, I think secular humanism is based on Christian humanism. I just think it has grown out of a Judeo-Christian worldview, and there's just no way of getting around that. I mean, some great books on that subject would include Nick Spencer's The Evolution of the West, Theo Hobson's I think it's called God Created Humanism. There's just a very obvious historical link and sort of way you can trace back current secular humanism and its ideals to a very clearly Judeo-Christian heritage. And it's very tiresome for me to hear atheists claiming, oh, we just come up with this fantastic new moral system called secular humanism, and just not to recognize where it came from. Nothing comes out of a vacuum. And this is most clearly just borrowing wholesale positions and moral views that Christianity created, that were not the way people thought before Christianity came on the scene. There's another great dialogue I could recommend from my show that's also on my YouTube channel. N.T. Wright and Tom Holland. If you haven't come across him, Tom Holland's a very popular historian here in the UK, and he is basically, gone on the attack against. As an agnostic, he went on the attack against secular atheists and humanists, claiming that they'd come up with this new morality. And as a historian of the Roman Empire, he said to them, look at the Roman Empire, look at what Christianity created. That's where your secular humanism came from. It's ridiculous to claim otherwise. And there's just a fantastic clip of him kind of explaining that on that YouTube video. But that would be my short-ish answer.
Yeah, a lot of this crowd was raised Christian, so they inherit the moral intuitions of Christianity, and then they start structuring a belief system based on their moral intuitions. So
I don't even have to be raised a Christian to benefit from it. As Jordan Peterson is keen to point out, we're swimming in it because that's the way what our culture has been bathed in for the best part of 2,000 years. So anyone who claims that they're somehow inventing something new, well, no, you're just riffing on what's been around. This isn't the way most cultures developed in the ancient world, or indeed in other parts of the world today. The thing that you've discovered was there all along. It's just you probably didn't like some of the ways in which it was being presented to you, and so on in the Christian world. But yeah, I'd say whether or not you were raised in a Christian family, you were raised in a Christian culture, or the post-Christian culture has, been, that Judeo-Christian ethic went so deep down that it's still there at an ultimate level, whether we recognize it or not.
So I think that from my perspective, there is a contradiction inside the secular humanist worldview that I'd like to get your take on. And I want to ask first, which is more important to you, truth or human well-being? If there is a situation where the two values come into conflict, which value would you sacrifice, and which value wins?
Yeah, I feel inevitably like that's a bit of a false dichotomy, because what would be the situation where truth trumps human well-being? I mean,
well, maybe I'm asking incorrectly because you're a believer, so you believe that you believe in God, and I guess from the atheist perspective, though, there is no God, so they perceive your worldview as untrue. But your worldview, as I'm illustrating here, has all of these tangible benefits in people's lives. So I guess from the secular humanist perspective, these two values come into conflict all the time, because if you have a belief in God that is technically untrue, and that produces so much human well-being, then you do have a conflict between these two values. I guess, so from your perspective, you have no conflict between these two values.
Sure.
And that makes your worldview internally consistent. But they, as you said so brilliantly here, they're riding off the backs of Christianity. They're taking both of those values. I've heard many of them say that truth is their highest value. Sam Harris famously says, he doesn't want to. He wants a religion where he doesn't have to believe any BS. So he's putting truth as his highest value, but at the same time, in the moral landscape, he puts human well-being as his highest value. So if that is an inconsistency in their worldview, and we come into situations where those two are in conflict, one has to give. Jordan Peterson famously talks about the hierarchy of values. And my question is, if truth and well-being are in your hierarchy of values, it's a hierarchy. One of them has to be above the other.
Yeah. Well, I think you've expressed it very well yourself there. That in my worldview, I don't think the two ever need to be mutually exclusive. Whereas I think they could well be in a naturalistic sort of secular humanist worldview, where we could be better off in terms of human well-being if we believed in God, a false belief, than if we didn't. This is in a sense where I see, a different, to use it in a pejorative term, faith creeping in to the secular humanist worldview. It's the faith that simply getting to the raw truth will produce a better world. Well, not necessarily. That if naturalism is true, the universe doesn't owe you anything. That the truth might be a cold, harsh, awful kind of existence. That might be the truth of the matter, and that's what you just have to accept if that's the case. So I think I essentially just agree with you, Adam, that there is a bit of a conflict there between those two values, as you say, in a secular humanist worldview, which I don't really see necessarily having to be the case in the Christian one.
So you've talked in previous conversations about morality being arbitrary. This comes up quite often when you're making a case for the theistic worldview. My question is, can an arbitrary morality survive in the real world? And if it can't, isn't morality by necessity objective?
Well, depends. I mean, so it depends what you mean by arbitrary. So what I would mean if I was saying that that morality might look arbitrary is if, as I say, if evolution in one culture develops a misogynistic view of women, if that's the direction that culture goes, and in another culture it develops a view that men and women are equal, if all that we've got to go on is what evolution happens to hand us, as our moral framework, then it looks pretty arbitrary. As arbitrary as whether we developed 5 fingers or 6 physically, it's going to be pretty arbitrary. Which now, if you're saying, in your view, those inferior moralities, the misogynistic societies or whatever, inevitably die out through some evolutionary process and produce, a society where people are equal and valued and so on, then obviously it's not arbitrary in that sense. There's a way in which if evolution always produces these optimal outcomes, then no, it's not arbitrary. But I would say it's only, firstly, I don't fully buy that story that evolution has this, always produces these optimal outcomes. And secondly, you still have to judge what counts as an optimal outcome. Why is the flourishing of all sentient life the optimal outcome for Sam Harris? Or why do some people place the emphasis on humans in particular? Why is that the optimal outcome, that humans flourish in culture? Another, a Peter Singer would say, well, you're being very speciesist if you're going to put all of the emphasis on humans. What about all the other sentient creatures out there? So there are lots of different standards, that we might choose as our kind of, that we want to be the optimal point. And the point for me is that if there is some standard out there, it transcends all of these biological and evolutionary categories. We've got to look for what this standard is, and if we think we've found it, it leads on to the very natural question: what's it grounded in? If it's not we're circling back obviously to where we began here, but that would be my view. Is it's it doesn't feel to me like you can just get your optimal sort of, you've still got to choose what's optimal. That's a philosophical kind of decision you make, and whether evolution brings that about, well, it may or it may not. Sometimes we might have to act against our evolutionary instincts actually to actually act in a moral way in the end.
Well, I think sometimes you do definitely have to do that. An example that I sometimes use is, and you're exactly right. What the goal is, what the yardstick is paramount. If you're designing a moral system to produce some kind of outcome, that whatever that outcome is going to affect how you design the moral system. If you're, let's just say you're designing an airplane, okay? There are a lot of different ways that you can design an airplane, but if you're designing an airplane for speed or designing an airplane for efficiency in trafficking people, you would design those airplanes completely differently. But those different goals, speed versus efficiency, are in the end, they're objective. They are objective. They would make the actual design features objective.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think is the way in which Sam Harris gets to objective morality, because he says, here's the goal, some kind of flourishing of human creatures and so on. And then you can objectively tell that if you do this, and if you do that, and if you do the other, that you're progressing towards that. Just like, if your objective is to make the fastest airplane, then you can objectively create the best conditions for that airplane to fly fast. But of course, that's the whole point. That's the glaring sort of thing in Sam Harris's whole philosophy, is that he's made a kind of his article of faith in the whole thing is this idea of human flourishing, and the whole point is, but where did you get that principle from? And I would say exactly as you've said, once you've got an objective, fast airplane, an efficient airplane, whatever, then of course you can measure things, and I've no problem with that. Science can be really helpful in measuring things, but the point is, we have that objective is going to be something that lies outside the scope of science. It's going to be something we philosophically have decided is the right way of going about things. So yeah, I mean, it's like if it's a bit like a game of chess. Sometimes atheists tell me morality is just like a game of chess. There are good moves and there are bad moves, and we don't need to appeal to a supernatural being to know that. It's just obvious. And the point is, yeah, there are, for the objective of that game, which is to capture the king or whatever. But you've still got but they're only good and bad insofar as they relate to an objective, okay? And in morality, you have to establish that objective before you can start to talk about things being good or bad in the first place. So until we get that kind of if we decide that the best kind of morality is for white Aryan individuals to rule the world, that's our objective. There are going to be objectively good ways to get to that outcome, and Hitler probably was onto some of them, But if we've decided on a very different objective, there's going to be another whole set of objective ways in which we can get to that outcome. And so for me, it all still boils down to something that sits outside of our particular system, because we have to decide in advance what's going to be the objective.
Do you fundamentally accept that we want to maximize human well-being? It seems like Christianity was designed to maximize human well-being.
in the sense of yes, but it might not be the same conception of well-being that a Sam Harris, or because again, some people think that well-being is essentially having the maximum amount of pleasure, let's say, the maximum amount of freedom, or whatever it might be, to do what we want. That might be their conception of what human well-being ultimately looks like. But Christianity may say, actually, there's a different conception of human well-being. And actually, it turns out that actually some things actually being limited, so for instance, your sexual freedom, or the, other elements of your life, there may actually serving others, doing things that are actually in some ways not immediately obviously beneficial to you, may actually be something that God wants to create in your life in a way that molds you and shapes you into a better type of human, into a person who is more, in a deeper way, a more fully flourishing human. And from that point of view, I'd say there's a sense in which you want to establish what this well-being is to start with. And Christianity, I think, is the ultimate way to achieve well-being, because I believe at the center of it, as I've said before, there's this person, Jesus Christ, who offers us himself. And that, for me, is the ultimate path to true human well-being and flourishing. But obviously, that's going to look very different to Sam Harris's definition of human flourishing, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, so this has been a fascinating talk, and I thank you for participating in it. For me, and the just to simplify the mechanistic worldview that I'm conceptualizing morality by. For me, morality is a strategy for survival and reproduction both for the individual and for the community that adopts a certain moral system with a certain design features. So these moral systems are competing on those design features, and where you bring up these other competing moral systems, they either survive or they don't survive over time. So if you look at it as a strategy, that strategy is either successful, it's either effective over time, or it's ineffective. So I would say that we can really judge a moral system's objectively by its success. And I often see Christianity. I mean, Christianity has a long track record of success. Secular humanism, not so much. So that is my way of looking at it. That's my last question. I'll let you reflect on that or give me your feedback.
Well, yeah, I get that. From your perspective, if that's kind of the ultimate end game, passing on our genetic DNA to the next generation, you could say, yeah, Christianity's been a very effective kind of container for doing that, and I get that. Obviously, I come at it from a very different perspective. I don't think that's the end game. I think that's part of the story. Is that we're here and we're kind of created to be fruitful and multiply, as the Bible puts it. But ultimately, I've got a very different conception of why we're here. Ultimately, I think we're here to discover what it is to be in relationship with each other and with our Creator. I think that's what's at the center of the human heart. I don't think we're ultimately defined by the biological drive to reproduce. For me, we're love is at the center of everything. That there really is this concept, and it's finds its center in God and Jesus Christ, and that we're called into exploring that and discovering that. So, and for that, and for me, that's the reason why Christianity has been so successful, because it's got the answer to that quest, to that ultimate longing in human hearts. It also happens to be a container within which cultures flourish and thrive, and that is to be expected. Now, for you, from your point of view, that makes it look like it's just got an evolutionary advantage on maybe some of the other belief systems out there. But for me, that doesn't give the full picture, because I think there's something intrinsically going on at a spiritual level, obviously, that kind of obviously is where we've just got a massive worldview difference between the two of us.
Well, the idea of survival and reproduction seems very, like I've said before many times, like this is a very cold way of looking at it. It's not a very motivating factor. Nobody wants to get out of bed because of, survival and reproduction. But it has developed in a way that makes us thrive. Like we work together in teams so efficiently, and we love doing these kind of things. Even these debates between the theists and the anti-theists are very much us playing out that team building psychology that we all enjoy so much. So I don't know, like I've said many times that I think the Christianity has far more motivating factors, but I think ultimately I want both of these kind of worldviews to be able to collaborate, to be able to work together. And I think that's part of the mission of Brett Weinstein. I think that's part of the mission of Jordan Peterson. And I myself, as someone, and I think a lot of people have a belief in God because they've had some personal experience that makes them feel God's presence. And I think there could be a biological component to that. Maybe I'm just not capable of having those kinds of experiences, and that's why I am in the situation that I am. But I don't think because of that we need to denigrate one another or put down people's faith. And I think a lot of the atheist side is they're smuggling in a presupposition that religion is evil or religion is bad. And I think my ultimate goal is to make people reconsider that perspective. So while my understanding may seem cold and unmotivating to you, I think to the atheist non-believer, I think it's a way of looking at the world and saying, hey, maybe Christians aren't so bad. Maybe what they have going is something good.
Well, I'd agree in the sense that I think there is a collaboration that can take place there, a fruitful collaboration. As I say, ultimately, we start from two very different worldviews, though, even if we get to some of the same conclusions about what's best for us in terms of morality and everything. And I wouldn't want to leave the conversation there. I think it's great that we get to that place, but I believe there's so much more. So that would obviously be, I'd want to pursue it further than that. But I always enjoy doing that in friendly, fruitful ways. And, and that's why I so appreciate someone like you, Adam, kind of working against the narrative of some of your fellow atheists, and wanting to have a much more kind of good-natured discussion about what we can achieve together. So yeah, sign me up. I'm all for kind of continuing that conversation, doing more together. But I'll never rest until you come over to our side eventually, Adam.
Well, we can talk more about that. I know your show is going to be in Southern California. So do you want to tell our audience a little bit about that?
A lot of your viewers might well be interested, especially in the Friday night in Costa Mesa. I'm going to be hosting a live edition of my show featuring Professor John Lennox, who's a wonderful Christian thinker, Oxford professor of mathematics and philosophy of science, in conversation with none other than Dave Rubin, who of the Rubin Report. Who's
somewhat of an anti-theist there, Dave Rubin.
Well, I don't know about that. I think he's actually seems to have grown very respectful under the influence of people like Jordan Peterson, of the important place that religion has played in society. So I don't get that sense from him. I think of just as his political views have changed a lot over the last 10 years. I think his religious views are slightly changing as well. I think it'd be a fascinating conversation between him and John Lennox, because they're going to be talking about God, faith, atheism, culture. And that's the Friday night that's Friday, the 11th of October, down in Costa Mesa. And then the Saturday, we've got an all-day kind of conference, apologetics conference, where we're going to be looking at the claims of Christianity, asking hard questions, hearing from some brilliant thinkers across the course of the day, including John Lennox, including Mary Jo Sharp, J. Warner Wallace, and a number of other Christian thinkers from that neck of the woods. So We're calling the whole thing Unbelievable live in LA, the 11th and 12th of October. And if you want more info and tickets, it's unbelievable.live.
And I'll go ahead and throw a link to that in the description as well. The other thing that you have coming out, you shared a talk that you moderated with Brett Weinstein, and I can't remember the name of the theologian.
Alistair McGrath.
Okay, so Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath, that was just amazing. This is coming out soon, right?
It's coming out soon, yeah. Perhaps even out by the time this talk goes up, I don't know. But basically, the 13th of September is when the video will drop. It was a live audience conversation that I moderated between Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath in London. Fantastic evening, great conversation between the two of them. And I think in some ways the Q&A actually surpassed the conversation. I don't know if you actually got to see the Q&A bit. I shared a sneak preview of their conversation, Adam, but the Q&A is really great as well. So that's going to be the first in what we're calling the big conversation. We started this last year, a special series of video dialogues between Christians and atheists or skeptics, included that conversation I mentioned earlier between Jordan Peterson and Susan Blackmore that kicked off last year's season. And we had further conversations with people like Daniel Dennett, Steven Pinker, Peter Singer, and some well-known Christian names. And this is season 2, kicking off with Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath. Also got some great conversations coming up with people like William Lane Craig and Sir Roger Penrose on mathematics, the universe, and God. Got that conversation between John Lennox and Dave Rubin live in LA. Great conversation on Jesus and the Gospels between Bart Ehrman, who's a well-known agnostic skeptic, but a high profile Bible scholar, in conversation with one of the world's top evangelical Bible scholars, Peter J. Williams. So lots of good content coming your way from the big conversation, and the place to get registered and to make sure you don't miss out is thebigconversation.show.
Yeah, it's amazing content, and you're doing a great job. You're really hitting it out of the ballpark. So I encourage everyone to subscribe to your YouTube channel and to be aware that these amazing conversations are out there, and they keep coming. So I guess we'll go ahead and leave it there. Do you want to say anything, any closing?
You've given me all the plugs I could ever want there, Adam. So thank you very much. But I've really genuinely appreciated this conversation. I really like what you're trying to do, and really appreciate it. And it's a very nice tonic for the kinds of conversations that I often end up getting embroiled in other forums. So thank you very much.
Well, it was a great pleasure to talk to you, and I thank you for being so generous with your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering. Because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering.